American media tycoon Rupert Murdoch's news corporation has been criticized for creating and spreading the Wuhan lab leak theory. When the first such story came out last year, Kevin Rudd, former Australian Prime Minister, said this China coronavirus conspiracy had just one aim: to get Donald Trump re-elected as US president. A year later, such stories are still being pursued on media controlled by the tycoon, despite international scientists saying such a leak was extremely unlikely. Is there a manipulation by the news corporation? If so, what's the aim? I'm pleased to be joined by Daryl Guppy, CEO of GuppyTraders.com, an international market education and training organization. He joins me to discuss this from Darwin, Australia, and from Chengdu in southwest China by Dr. Shenyu Jia, associate researcher at the School of International Studies at Sichuan University. The warmest welcome to both of you. Now, in May last year, the Daily Telegraph, a Murdoch-controlled tabloid, published a story by a reporter called Shari Markson, claiming the coronavirus may have come from a lab in Wuhan. It cited a, quote, dossier prepared by concerned Western governments, unquote, to back the allegation. It was quickly picked up and exaggerated by some US media. For instance, the New York Post called it a damning dossier leaked from the intelligence agencies of the Five Eyes. And Fox News host Tucker Carlson called this, quote unquote, the most substantial confirmation of what we suspected that we have had so far. These two media outlets are also owned by Murdoch. Now, the intelligence agencies of these countries quickly distanced themselves from this claim. The Guardian, which is not controlled by Murdoch, revealed that there was no new information in the so-called document. It did not outline any direct evidence of the lab leak, and it wasn't called from intelligence gathered by the Five Eye network. So, Dr. Shen, let me go to you. Was this a coincidence that the Daily Telegraph, the New York Post, and the Fox picked up this story and amplified it quickly?
Well, before I go into answer this question, I would like to make a point that in the last few years, the biased view towards China coverage has become a norm. And the two media that you just mentioned had the reports they have been covering. It's actually been so for several years. It's just about the coverage of COVID-19. It's actually about other issues involving China. And I think in this case, in the COVID-19 case, it's more about at the expense of the security and intelligence establishment. And consequently, it's more of a narrow framework of selecting what they want to cover and how to cover it. And of course, I think with the two media that you just mentioned, there's nothing much about coincidence. It has been a trend for a few years. And of course, I think the conspiracy theory they have proposed is more of attracting the subscription, and also to push for their agenda, the agenda that they want the readers or their audiences to receive.
Mr. Guppy, what is your view on this?
Well, the original story was a load of rubbish, had nothing to do with the Five Eyes intelligence and security network, which is why they distanced themselves from the story. However, it suited Murdoch's agenda, and his agenda at that time was to help get President Trump re-elected. That's what he was really on about. But it was also part of a broader anti-China narrative, as Professor Shan has indicated. And this has been consistent and constant.
How do you look at the so-called feedback loop that's been described by some people in the media, meaning you create the impression that you are not the only one talking about this, someone else on another channel is also talking about, or another source is also backing this up, and somehow the story gains momentum, picks up strength, credibility. How do you look at that? And could it be proven that these media organizations didn't really collude with each other to give life to the conspiracy theory? Dr. Shen.
I think in Australia's media field, there's two sectors. One is public and one is private. And in terms of the public ones, should be the Australian Broadcasting Group. They are actually the first media that started the story with China's influence. And they have been pushing this agenda or this sort of impression for a long time. And then when the COVID-19 outbreak happened, the Rupert Murdoch's media jumped in, and they started with those Chinese virus title on the tabloid paper. And then the tabloids are talking about, the virus is coming from China. And this all sort of created a very negative image about China, which actually, as we said, it has become a norm in the past few years. And they've been trying to, they've been trying to actually create a story or create an image that, anything associated with China is negative. And it's actually been happening and being actually framed that way by both the respectable media, let's say the public ones like Australian Broadcasting Group nationally in Australia, and also by the tabloids. Most of them are controlled by the Rupert Murdoch's News Corp in Australia.
Mr. Guppy, do you agree with this assessment? If so, what do you think is pushing this kind of negative reporting about China, especially on the conspiracy theory concerning the origin of the coronavirus?
I certainly agree with the assessment, and part of what's happened with Western media is that we've established what's called an echo chamber. So we have, for instance, in Sky News, which is the Murdoch-controlled TV, we have their hosts, their anchors, interviewing journalists from The Australian, which is, of course, a Murdoch newspaper. So it feeds on itself in a circular fashion. This also leaks into social media as well. So we see these effects on YouTube and other internet-based media. So even a small story is able to gain a great deal of traction and is tweeted and retweeted and so on. Now, President Trump was very, very good at taking advantage of the way that news spread in a viral sense. Rupert Murdoch and his organisation is taking this to the next level. And in this particular case, there is a strong anti-China bias that was already in place in newspaper reporting and media reporting before the outbreak of COVID-19. COVID-19 just gave them an additional platform which they could use.
But what do you think is driving all of this anti-China campaign? Exactly what is the end game, or what is the agenda they want to set, Mr. Guppy?
The agenda is an anti-China agenda. Rupert Murdoch has always used his media to wield influence in political circles. If we talk about Australia, the most infamous example is the 1975 election, where the then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam was thrown out of Parliament. The Parliament was prorogued or closed down. That election, Murdoch was clearly on the side of the Conservative powers. Murdoch is a very conservative person, and he's become more conservative as he's grown older. Now he throws his support behind the Republicans, behind President Trump, and this anti-China campaign. He has a particular set against China, perhaps because many years ago he was unable to break into the China media market.
Kevin Rudd said the China coronavirus story by some media under the News Corporation had one aim, which was to get Trump re-elected. So, Dr. Shen, now that a year has passed, but these stories are still circulating in the Australian media, what could be the aim now, if there is one?
Well, I think one thing that we probably need to clarify is that I think the Rupert Murdoch is always behind the conservatives worldwide, actually, not just in Australia, but also in the UK and in the US, like Guppy has just said, that he's behind the Republicans. And in Australia, I think he's definitely behind the conservatives of the Liberal and National Coalition Party, which is the party that the ruling party in Australia now. And I think definitely Rupert Murdoch and the News Corporation has always had a very deep affiliation with the politics sphere. One thing that the conservatives in Australia, well, let's say probably some of the politicians in the Liberal parties definitely had their goal of being anti-China. Well, the election is coming up soon, and creating an enemy and using the weapon of fear could help them get elected. So in Australia, I think it's definitely also with the election, with the national politics, the domestic politics. And also, I think the Rupert Murdoch, as Guppy has said, when he failed to break into the China market, I guess his attitude towards China started to become sour.
Until recently, as I said, the lab leak theory is still being pursued by the same journalist, Sherry Markson. She was hyping that the virus could have been genetically modified in Wuhan, even as a bioweapon. And she was appearing on American talk shows, including, of course, Fox. And this has been called, as I said, a feedback loop. Mr. Guppy, why do you think all of this is finding a particularly fertile ground in the corona origin story, and especially now, after a year has gone by when her first story last May was very quickly discredited by others in the media, you know, calling that the dossier she quoted was basically a numb paper, and especially after scientists who went into Wuhan to study the lab said the lab leak theory is extremely unlikely.
This is primarily about fear. In the Australian situation, there has been a long-lasting fear of foreigners, people, particularly people from Asia and China. This has been reflected in Australian national policy numerous times since Federation, since 1900. And this is an extension of course, people worldwide are feeling frightened by the impact of COVID. So they're looking for someone to blame. The easiest people to blame? Oh, let's blame China. We already have a narrative that is promoting China as something to be worried about, a threat and so on. So this adds to this threat narrative. It's just one string of that. So then we look at, for instance, the United States that has just granted millions of dollars to formally promote anti-China propaganda as a government aim, as a government policy. You put that together with organisations in Australia, like the Australian Security Policy Institute, which is funded by the Americans, funded by American arms manufacturers. Of course, it's in their interest to create an enemy, to create a climate of fear, because this helps to drive their national policy objectives. And we don't have an independent media that speaks against it.
Regardless, the same journalist is publishing her book on the subject, and with the publishing house, guess what, also controlled by Murdoch. Dr. Shen, to wrap up, is this another coincidence?
Well, I guess it's not. I think with the News Corporation, nothing is really much of a coincidence. I've said there are a few reasons that they've been creating these sort of negative images about China, and the narrative has been like that for a few years. And I guess one thing that I want to also say, as Guppy has referred, is the fair. The fair also attracts subscription, you know, attracting their audiences. Yeah. News Corp definitely is a media that is renowned or notoriously for their eye-catching stories, which has not much of legitimacy in it. Yeah,
we are running out of time. I have to leave it there. The latest news article that caught my attention is about the so-called leaked documents from China, also by the same reporter, saying that Chinese military discussed the weaponization of SARS coronavirus in the past, it turned out. And I looked on the Chinese website yesterday, Taobao. The so-called leaked document is actually a book that's widely available in China about possible U.S. weaponization of the SARS coronavirus a couple of years ago. So I wonder exactly how solid her lab leak claim is based on. Anyway, hopefully time will tell, right? Hopefully. Many thanks to my guest, Daryl Guppy, CEO of GuppyTraders.com, and Dr. Shenyu Jia, Associate Researcher from the School of International Studies at Sichuan University.